Good morning, First Christian Church. This is your midweek message, and who knows, you might have saw him or him.
It was me.
Most definitely him. And today we are going to talk about his sermon in the sense of questions that some people might have had. If we got any questions in the Dropbox, if not, we would be going over some questions that from small group, right?
Yeah.
Or
Yeah.
in some cases that we just might have ourselves.
Okay. Well, this week we were in Acts chapter 21, verses 1 through 36. We talked about how Paul had just left some tear-felt goodbyes with the Ephesian elders, and it was forever goodbyes. He's getting ready to journey to Jerusalem. Along the way, he gets some warnings of why not to go to Jerusalem because some things. There were two different groups. Actually, there was a group of disciples, and then there was a prophet named Agabus. Both of them, at different stops along the journey to Jerusalem, had warned Paul, "Don't go to Jerusalem." And it was said that it was information from the Holy Spirit to them that they were saying not to go on. I talked about that a little bit and unpacked how it could seem in our own reading as though Paul was ignoring the Spirit's prompting, but that doesn't seem to be the case at all. Brought up the story we know from literature with the Iliad, and so like Hector brought up from history, Socrates brought up the martyr Polycarp, but also if we remember when Jesus was coming into his last couple days, he was sharing with the disciples, hey, this is what's about to happen, and they just weren't getting it. And when they were getting pieces of it, they were like, oh, that's not going to happen. Jesus isn't going to die. That's no. And so this seems to be a similar type of thing where some people have some knowledge from the Spirit. Hey, this is what's going to happen to Paul. We don't want that to happen to Paul. Paul's our friend. Paul's our mentor. Paul's the guy. Like, that can't happen. We've already lost Jesus, and then he was resurrected, but now he's gone to heaven. But this can't happen to Paul, too. What are we going to do? Paul, don't go to Jerusalem, is basically what they're saying. And so Paul actually has a response of like, hey, like, why are you causing me this additional anguish? Why would you cause me to cry over this? Like, I've already determined in my mind that I would go to prison for Christ. But even beyond going to prison, I'm ready to die for him. Let's unpack that statement just a little bit, because I think that's a big point that I didn't get to talk about this past week. Is like to be able to say I would go to prison for Christ is a bold statement, one in which we see he actually was willing to live out and ready to live out. We may say something in a moment of overzealousness, but are we actually at those places? But then he takes it a step further and says, not only am I willing to go to prison, I'm ready to die if I have to for Jesus. And so how does that hit you guys?
I wonder if at the time he was thinking of, since he's at prison, he might be dead anyways. In which case he might be saying it like, I'm in prison, like I said, or was this after he got out of prison?
This is before he goes to prison.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
So, well, like still in the sense of if he goes to prison, he might die in prison.
Mm-hmm.
In which case he would still be dying for Christ anyways.
Mm-hmm.
Which stand up for what you believe in a sense.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that good on him.
Yeah, good on him. That's fair.
I think it speaks largely to how Paul was clearly just all in on his call to preach the word of Jesus and just to follow Jesus. Like there's nothing of greater importance, and we like to say that Christ is of greatest importance, but living it is a completely different thing. And for Paul to truly be all in means there's nothing left on the table, not even my life. And that's a big thing to say, but clearly that's where his heart was. Like everything's gone now. Everything that's not Christ is secondary now, and I think that led him to a place where even his life wasn't off the table, which is cool.
Man, I think that prompts something for me, Brad. You just said that like he's all in, and sometimes we like to think that we are. And like I know for me, I find myself frustrated sometimes whenever I hear somebody speaking out against the bride of Christ and speaking out against the church. In we'll just put it in a vague statement like this: well, the church needs to be doing and fill in the blank. And it's like, man, if we're part of the church, then we're part of that call. And so like I don't know if that's been the case for you, but when somebody says something like, man, the church just isn't, or the church is, well, we need to, and it's like, well, I'm part of that. And so if I'm saying that this is a need and I'm unwilling to fulfill it, then basically what I've said is I'm not all in. And that's a big deal because we're talking about, are we in or are we not? Paul obviously was. And so he goes to Jerusalem, and the elders there basically put him on kind of on trial of sorts themselves because they're just like, hey, Paul gives this whole introduction of what had been happening among the Gentiles, and then is really excited. All these people are meeting. His worlds are kind of colliding. The Christians in Jerusalem and the Gentile Christians are finally meeting. I could see a lot of reason for excitement on his part. And then the Jerusalem Christians also say, praise God for what's been happening, but they move very quickly into criticism and then ask him to jump through a few hoops for him. And it's like, man, I think sometimes we do that. We sometimes, whether it's accidental or whether it's on purpose, but we find ourselves in places of making people jump through hoops to prove to us that they're where we think they should be. Do you think we do that sometimes?
I feel like, I don't know if our church specifically does that in a sense, but as people, we most definitely do that. Like, you have to prove yourself, like you're worthy enough. But I mean, we shouldn't be proving ourselves to other people. We should be proving ourselves to God.
That's a great point. Yeah. One of the other things probably worth noting is Paul's humility here, because it twofold. One is that these people who are asking him, he had probably outworked them in every sense of the word. He had done more in the kingdom than they had in Jerusalem because of all the places he'd gone, all the sufferings he had endured, and all the conflicts that he'd had. And they're judging his worthiness. And for him to take that is so humble, to submit himself to leadership, even though he was probably the better leader. That's a big deal. But then to just simply consider the mission greater than himself across the board. So he's asked to jump through some hoops. The hoop is basically take a vow so that not only we can see, but everybody else can see you actually are as Jewish as we've said and you've said. And so he submits to it and he goes through it. But in the midst of that, jumping through a hoop, catastrophe comes his way. Near the end of the ritual purification that he was subjected to, some people throw claims against him because they recognized him from their time in Asia. They drag him out in front of a mob. And that's one of the points that I had made is like when he is drug out from the mob, who doesn't show up? The same elders who asked him to jump through these hoops, they don't come running in to rescue him. They don't come in saying, hey, what you're doing, this isn't right. We know Paul, and what you perceive, they don't show up. Yeah. So they make him jump through the hoop. But when things get hairy, when things get hard, they're nowhere to be found in this scenario. Paul's left to his own devices to fend for himself. Fortunately for him, and I think by God's providence, the Roman guard comes in. But the big point that I made there that I think is worth grabbing onto is I had said, basically, it's not only what we do that the church will be remembered for, but also what we do not do that will be remembered for. And these guys are remembered in this story for what they didn't show up and rescue Paul. Um, what what do you think that statement does for us in thinking about what kind of church to be? Because a lot of times we focus on what to do, but what things might we be ignoring that we shouldn't be? What sticks into your mind? Like what jumps out? And there's this fill in the blank that we probably should do more with.
That's a big question.
Yeah.
Um, I would comment with the disclaimer that I'm referring to the church in general, as in my church experience in my lifetime, and not our specific church, just here. But my experience in the church has been that we are woefully unwilling to take care of the poor and to take care of to really be impactful into the needs of the community we're in. Now obviously not every church is that way, and I'm not saying that we're that way, but that is something that I think we will definitely, if we were to have to answer for not doing something, I think that's something that we have a tendency to not do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not wise enough to know how we fix that.
Mm-hmm.
But that's definitely something that comes to mind.
Mm-hmm. And so going back to how I talked about it earlier, as far as like, man, if we make a statement like the church is not doing, then we also need to own that.
Yeah.
And
absolutely.
so the fairness in this is, if we recognize a need like that, we are part of the church. Guys, we should be getting involved in ministries to people who are living in poverty, and not just feeling good about going in and serving in a soup kitchen. That's a great thing. Okay, I'm not going to negate that or downplay that at all. But like, that may not be an ongoing fix. That's a one and done where we feel good, we pat ourselves on the back. It's kind of like the short-term mission trip. Again, it has its purpose, but the person that's going to make the difference is the person who moves there and lives there and ministers among those people forever. And so there are things that we can be involved in forever ways. We can invite people into our homes. We can put ourselves in their paths on a consistent basis, not just when it is convenient or whenever we know that people are watching, but we actually make a difference in a way where we step in. Ways that we can do that in other ways, like we see somebody that is crying out for help, we get involved. We don't just say, oh man, somebody should do that. Well, we're somebody, and we've been commissioned to be the light of the world. So we get to do that. We get to be a part of healing people, stepping into situations where other people are uncomfortable. We get to be a part of things like fostering and adopting, welcoming people into our lives forever if needed. And not just the one and done, because that tends to be where we do some of these things. Like, let's do a building project. It's got a short term, and then we're done and we can move on and we feel good. We post pictures. I think the charge, and I'm willing to get in on this, so it's not that I'm just putting a thing out there, is that we actually get involved in lives in permanent ways. And I know that at least among the three of us, that's real in our lives. We're involved in some permanent parts of our lives, welcoming people that are not naturally part of our life into it. And I think that makes a difference. And I think that everybody in our church, both locally and globally, has the capacity to do this. It's whether we're willing. Paul was willing to be in completely for Jesus. And it may be that, I'm called to something, that you're called to something different, and you're called to something different. But at the end of the day is the question, are you all in for Christ? Thanks.